Today on CityCast Chicago, the head of CTA is retiring, the city council debates speed limit changes, and how would you spend $500,000 in your ward? Joining me to break it all down, executive producer Simone Alisea. It's Tuesday, January 14th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Morning, Simone. How you feeling? How was your weekend?
It was all right. Pretty busy. I had some people I was trying to see, and so I actually went out this weekend, which almost never happens. I finally saw Wicked. That was exciting. But yeah, how was your weekend?
Overall, I didn't do anything. After a busy few weeks, I stayed inside for the most part. I watched Forrest Gump for the first time.
Interesting. How'd you feel about that?
I took copious notes. I have a lot of thoughts. That movie was wild from start to finish.
That is a wild thing to watch for the first time in the year of our Lord 2025.
I wrote no less than maybe 1,500 words of notes, and maybe one day I'll share them. But yeah, that's what I did. And then I watched the Packers lose. And so,
hey, not so bad. Not a bad weekend.
Overall, a decent weekend. I think coming into the start of the week, if people listen to yesterday's episode, we were talking about power in the city of Chicago, particularly amongst our politicians, our executives, our head of agencies and departments. And at one point during the episode, we were talking about the head of CTA, Dorval Carter, who was, as of, the start of 2025, going into his 10th year in this position. At one point, Brandon Pope, who was on the episode, said he has the job security I aspire to. And then smack dab, we walked in Monday morning and Dorval Carter announced he is retiring as the head of CTA. If you've been following this podcast for any amount of time, we have talked about Dorval Carter, who is retiring amidst a regional transit financial cliff, slowly improving service numbers and hiring numbers, and long-standing criticism about CTA's efficiency, safety, overall rider experience, and the experience of the people who work for CTA. Simone, I think we're both on the same page. We appreciate that they didn't do this Friday night going out the door.
I was utterly shocked that this announcement came at a reasonable time of day because that has certainly not been the case in previous leadership changes in recent months, right? This news about Dorval Carter retiring, it's so interesting because for the past couple of years, you and I have talked about on this show all of the ways Chicagoans, CTA writers, aldermen, city council members, at one point, the governor alluding to the idea that CTA needs a change in leadership. The agency, I think sort of most primarily and sort of most on the forefront, just really struggling after the pandemic, right? Obviously, the pandemic, just really did a number on transit systems across the country. But in Chicago in particular, the recovery has been really slow. And part of that is stuff that the agency theoretically sort of controls, right? We think about this debate about ghost buses and ghost trains, right? That there were trains and buses scheduled, but they never showed up, or they were showing up, 30, 40 minutes late. So that just sort of baseline reliability of, is the bus and train going to come when the agency says it's going to come? That was that question. Let alone sort of like when you get these reductions in ridership, there's just also just the general quality of writing has really gone down. Cleanliness, an issue reported among CTA writers. In the pandemic era, you also had more people who were experiencing homelessness, who were taking shelter on the train, and the agency sort of trying to address that population and how the train was being used in that way. And then on top of that, concerns about safety. I think in particular, toward the end of last year, there were sort of several or a few high profile shootings that happened on CTA. There is sort of this sense that not only are trains and buses not coming regularly when they're supposed to be coming, but also when the train comes, my experience is not as good as it used to be. My experience is not as comfortable as it used to be. And this was just something that was really plaguing Carter in the past few years. while he was not coming to city council meetings and hearings that he should have been at. And eventually the city council had to mandate that he sit before them quarterly.
I think rider experience and putting so much of that on leadership at CTA is really a sort of tough pill to swallow, because it's so difficult for like Dorval Carter himself to have any sort of like day-to-day impact on like mine or your experience on CTA. But when you couple that with the experience of the people who were working for CTA, you had drivers and operators of both trains and buses also saying that they saw a drop in efficiency. They saw a drop in work quality as CTA was having a tough time hiring. They saw that they were getting the brunt when it came to scheduling.
And also safety concerns among operators as well.
Manny Ramos from Block Club Chicago wrote back in April of 2024 that a bus driver suffered a medical emergency behind the wheel and was left for over an hour before medical help arrived. So it's basic gaps in the system directly underneath Carter's control that were also under heavy scrutiny, as much as any personal Chicagoans' experience on CTA. And so I understand during the pandemic era, as Carter sat in front of city council, I remember back in May, he, in some ways blasted city council, talked about how you've been turned into a caricature, how their entire Twitter accounts dedicated to calling for his firing, how he felt the way he was being degraded was in line with other Black leaders over the course of Chicago's history. And so I understand in some ways the frustration of how much is put on his and others' shoulders. But for so many of the things that were directly in his control, like you said, showing up, creating a better work environment, those things were not happening at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned we kind of had talked about Carter's job security in yesterday's episode. And the reason that we imagined he had so much job security, despite the fact that, people had kind of been calling for his head loudly for a couple of years now, is it's a really hard job to do. There's just not a lot of people with experience running a transit system for a major American city, right? These are complex systems. And Carter, certainly had bona fides, right? In addition to having worked for the CTA at various points throughout his career, he also worked at the Federal Transit Administration and also for the U.S. Department of Transportation. Certainly came to the position with a lot of knowledge. He was appointed in 2015 by Mayor Rahm Emanuel, so had some staying power too, right? Was able to survive a couple of mayoral terms. And I think pre-pandemic, any issues with the CTA were maybe not quite as acute. Certainly there's always concerns about cleanliness to some degree. I think even at that point, they had struggled with staffing on some level. Yep. But I think particularly just the service drop after 2020 and sort of the slow recovery really was kind of the thing that that created this pressure. That said, Mayor Brandon Johnson, up until and even now, has never had a bad word to say about Dorval Carter.
I'm not surprised he let him go out on his own accord at all. In hindsight, at least a smart political tactic, in the sense that it is a difficult job to hire. It is a tough situation to come into. And at least the person coming into it has some sense that the mayor has their back, because he did not drag Carter through the mud over the last year and a half.
No, repeatedly. I mean, immediately when he came into office, this was a question, are you going to replace Carter? And repeatedly, Johnson sort of sidestepped and was like, we don't talk about that. And then at various points sort of lauded Carter's ability to lead the agency, lauded his experience. When we asked him in the spring of 2024, we posed it very directly. And he once again was like, I don't talk about personnel issues. I'm not going to talk about this. And then in the press release that announced Carter's departure, Johnson, again, thanked Carter for his service and particularly lauded Carter's leadership and success in securing federal funding for the Red Line extension before the inauguration of Donald Trump coming up next week. we've talked about this on the show in the past few days too, right? This is a big deal because, with this new presidential administration, no funding is guaranteed, especially for Chicago. And so to be able to secure funding for this major construction capital investment that, people have been calling for decades does say something, right? That's nothing to sneeze at as far as accomplishments go. But again, it's just that day-to-day experience of CTA writers. Like, I cannot kind of emphasize enough of how if your writers day to day are having poor experiences, what else? What else? That's the whole job. That's it.
Exactly.
That's the whole thing you got to do is get people from point A to point B, safely and somewhat comfortably.
It felt like this was the time to get out, though. You secured the funding for the Red Line extension, a decades-old project. The person coming after you is going to have to tackle a $577 million budget shortfall as the state considers whether or not to consolidate all regional transit under sort of one official body.
The timing does feel astute, especially with, as you mentioned, that proposed in Springfield lawmakers considering merging CTA, Metra, and PACE to help stave off a multi-million-dollar fiscal cliff that is coming as a result of drying up of pandemic funds. I think the other thing that you brought up and that I'm thinking about is now Chicago does not have a permanent transit head. We do not have a permanent public schools head with Pedro Martinez going out the door. And we don't have a permanent public housing head right now after Tracy Scott stepped down late last year. And so it is a very interesting time in Chicago's sister agencies at this moment.
Currently, board chairwoman Angela Herlock serves as the interim chief executive officer for the Chicago Housing Authority. CPS CEO Pedro Martinez, while other things play out, as far as we know, will stay on through the end of the school year. And Dorval Carter will finish out the remaining weeks in January. From what I understand, he's not simply retiring from CTA and like riding off into the sunset or anything. Of course, not on a bus or a train. He's leaving to lead St. Anthony Hospital on Chicago's west side. As we've alluded to and said very directly, it's going to be hard replacing him. And we'll see how long it takes the Johnson administration to do just that. Tomorrow, the Chicago City Council is set to decide whether to reduce the city's speed limit to 25 miles per hour from 30 miles per hour in an effort to make the city's roadways safer after a surge of deaths in recent years, even by 5 miles. I do expect, for me personally, this means I'm going to be giving a few more fines and fees to the city. But overall, I do support any and all efforts to improve the safety on city roadways. This feels like a mixture between what advocates want, but also, an attempt to also get some more money for the city.
We've talked before about the effort to reduce Chicago's speed limit. It was passed in committee in the fall, but has sort of languished as supporters try to kind of whip up the votes to see, like, can they actually get this passed through the full city council? And as you point out, I think when it comes to speed limits, it is a bit of a tougher pill to swallow, even if there are demonstrated safety benefits. There are lots of other cities that have done this and have done this like specifically from 30 to 25 and have seen some improvements in their safety numbers. But as you point out, Chicago also has this relationship with automated enforcement and speed cameras that are sort of a bit of a nuisance, frankly. And, what is that? How does that enforcement look? And is the enforcement applied equitably? And I think, like I said, just a bit of a harder pill to swallow. Now, it's interesting because as this vote is about to take place, we got some stories out of the Chicago Tribune, our colleague Sarah McRae, who wrote about specifically making streets safer for young people, looking into the data around how many youths have been struck by a vehicle while while walking or while on a bicycle. And some really, really interesting numbers there. I think it was something like well over 2,800 since 2021. Some other details about deaths and putting together a map of where that happened. Some of the most concentrated areas of crashes way up on the far north side and sort of like West Rogers Park almost, on the far west side, and then also on the southwest side. These are parts of the city that maybe don't follow the grid, to the letter, the way central parts of the city do. On the southwest side in particular, a lot of these roads are built for freight, for trucking. And so you can understand why there would be a greater risk of getting hit by a car. And I think the other thing that's interesting about this story is when the improvements that parents, advocates, people are talking about to improve safety for kids, particularly walking or biking to school, a lot of that has to do with actual the physical way the roads are built, adding roundabouts, creating bump outs, essentially extending the curb to make crosswalks shorter, in addition to things like bike lanes and things like that. And so it is interesting the way we talk about road safety can really vary. Speed is obviously one component. The faster you go, the deadlier any potential crash might be. But I think, actually creating a road in which the default is to drive safely can also make a huge difference.
Yeah, when you look at the numbers, it's hard to argue against taking this measure. Like you said, nearly 3,000 young people between the ages of 1 and 19 hit in the last almost 4 years. Black Chicagoans are nearly 4 times more likely to be killed in traffic crashes. The elderly are more likely to be impacted by traffic accidents, to be severely harmed or to be killed. I just want to see the city take a more progressive and hopefully a more quick approach to addressing some of the other factors, like you said, like the way roads are built, adding more bike lane safety, or adding more bike lanes, adding more protection, safety barriers for bikers in and around the city, building more trails for bikers, investing in more carless roads. I just don't want to see a situation in which we are consistently only addressing one part of the problem or taking such a piecemeal approach to the way we design, because I understand from one part of the city to the next, it's going to be more difficult to make infrastructure changes. But if we don't have a more citywide approach, a more collaborative approach, I just fear that we limit our ability to really address these inequities, and we're just going to see more sort of tickets and fees going up. In some neighborhoods or wards, the way decisions are made on pedestrian and cyclist infrastructure is through menu funds, right? These discretionary funds that each alder is able to decide how is used in their ward. Each alder gets about $1.5 million to decide how they're going to use in their ward. And in the 26th ward, Alder Jesse Fuentes has opened up about $500,000 of that for residents to decide how it's going to be used in neighborhoods like Hermosa, Humboldt Park, Logan Square, and West Town. Right now, 26 ward residents can vote on a number of different packages that include specific projects on quality of life, community and safety issues, and neighborhood vitality. Some of the improved projects ideas submitted by residents include Maple Park improvements at 2047 North Spalding and Logan Square, a mural on the viaduct of Potomac and Central Park Avenues and Humboldt Park. Simone, what are a couple of the other ones?
Yeah, some more park signage around 1918 North Central Park Avenue, and other signage for roundabouts on Wabansia, and a community green space outside of an elementary school. Basically, these menu funds are typically used for, they have to be used for capital projects, right? You're going to build something or improve something or repair something. We're talking infrastructure improvements. They can't be used to fund a program, right? To operate a program in one of these places. And there are, about a dozen or so alders who do some form of participatory budgeting. Jacoby, I am curious, number one, do you know if your alder does participatory budgeting? And even if they don't, what would you want to see menu funds used for in your ward?
I am in the 4th ward, which stretches from Kenwood into Bronzeville into the South Loop. And I'm not sure if Lamont Robinson does any participatory, but a couple of things that came to mind. One, the basketball courts along Lakeshore, I think between 43rd and 35th. I'd love to see those invested in. There's one that, at least last time I checked, looked like it was in dire need of some improvement. So, with all of these recent, like D-Rose related projects, he's going to get his jersey retired next year. I'd love to see some improvements along the lake on those basketball courts. And then there are a lot of people who end up, especially around this time of the year, taking shelter outside of the Jewel Osco off of Roosevelt and State, or Roosevelt and Wabash. And there, at this point, is I can't call it abandoned, but it's a unused building that sits right on the corner of State and Roosevelt. And I would love to see that somehow taken over by the ward and turned into like a warming center of some sort for people who are either waiting for the train, taking refuge outside, provide some type of resource or services for the unhoused or the people who are waiting for the train right there. I think that'd be great. What about you, Simone?
That's a really good one. I live in the 48th ward, whose alder is Lenny Mana Hoppenworth, who was just elected in 2023. And she does do a form of participatory budgeting, basically just sort of solicits possible projects on an ongoing basis for menu funds. The tricky thing about the 48th, when I was thinking about kind of like what kinds of infrastructure improvements I would want to see, particularly near where I live, near the eastern side of the ward, there was already so much construction because of the Red Line. Pretty much like every, east-west street from the lake to the train is just undergoing some kind of construction right now. And so there's already lots of updates happening on that front. One thing that I thought of is there is a park near me just at the very southern edge of the ward, Buttercup Park. And it's actually kind of more of a concrete park. It's got these beautiful twinkly lights. And every time I pass by it in the summer, I'm always like, man, that would be such a great place to hold like a community dance or like for a band shell or something like that. And but the problem is it's concrete. So dancing on it would be really hard on your knees. So I'd love to see like a dance floor or like a platform of some kind built out there to have like a community event that doesn't destroy your joints.
I feel that.
I think that would be really fun and just like something that, and again, you'd have to consider like noise concerns, I think probably, but it's just like the setting is so beautiful and it just looks like this pretty urban park. And it's just like, again, there's a lot of housing around there already. And it would just be such a great community space, I think, for people to gather and hold events. So something like that would be really nice too. But I really like your idea of doing something for the unhoused community.
I'd love to hear from listeners, like whether you live in the 26th ward and you're going to actually be voting on how Alder Fuentes spends this money, or if you live in another ward and you want to tell us what you'd improve if you could vote on $500,000, let us know by leaving us a text or a voicemail at 773-780-0246. And to learn more about the tenure of Dorval Carter, the head of CTA, who is now retiring, the speed limit debate in city council, or to learn more about menu funds or infrastructure funds in your ward, please head to our show notes. As always, thank you to our executive producer, Simone Alisea. I appreciate you, my friend.
Hey, thanks, Jacoby.
Before we get out of here, please bookmark our website, chicago.citycast.fm. There you can read all of our latest articles, which we update almost every single day. You can subscribe to our daily newsletter, Hey Chicago, check out our neighborhood and walking guides, and so much more. Of course, I can't let you go without some good news. Jazz and Gumbo is back at Dorian's tomorrow night and features Chicago's very own Kai Crusade. Doors open at 7 and the show begins at 8. Check the show notes for ticket links. As always, we appreciate you for listening and reading. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Peace.
Things are shaking up in the city, I guess, is the best way to describe it.
Tune in for next week's episode of Dragon Ball Z.